Picture a medieval peasant. You know exactly what his life looks like. He is filthy. He is starving. He works from the moment the sun rises until it sets, 7 days a week, until he dies of old age at 35. It is a life of unremitting misery, a dark age of slavery in all but name. Everyone knows this, but everyone is wrong. Because if you actually look at the records, the church calendars, the manor rolls, the labor laws, you find a statistic that seems impossible. That miserable peasant, he had more time off than you do. In fact, he worked fewer hours for his boss, had more job security, and arguably, less stress than the average modern worker. So why do we remember it so differently? Welcome to Know History. Today, we're going to find out why we invented the myth of the miserable peasant. I grew up with the same image of the Middle Ages that you did. It's the Monty Python version of history. Mud, filth, oppression. We use the word medieval as an insult. It means backward, barbaric. And this belief rests on 3 pillars that seem unshakable. First, we assume the work was endless. We imagine the peasant as a machine, driven by a cruel lord who could whip him if he stopped ploughing for even a minute. Second, we assume they were essentially slaves. The word serf actually comes from the Latin servus, meaning slave. And third, we assume the physical toll was catastrophic. If they weren't working, they were dying of plague or starvation. It makes sense to us. After all, we live in the age of technology, medicine, and democracy. Logic dictates that life must have been worse back then. If we are at the peak of human progress, they must have been at the bottom. I believed this for years. It's a comforting story. It tells us that no matter how tired we are after a 40-hour work week, at least we aren't them. But then I stumbled across a study by an economist named Juliet Shaw, and she pointed out something that historians have known for decades, but the rest of us completely missed. The evidence for the miserable peasant isn't in the medieval records, it's in our heads. Because when you open the actual books from the 13th and 14th centuries, the math simply doesn't add up. Let's look at the calendar. This is the smoking gun. In the modern world, we divide our time into work days and weekends. But the medieval world ran on a different clock, the church clock. First, you have Sundays. The church was incredibly strict about this. Servile labor, like ploughing or harvesting, was forbidden. Now, to be clear, animals don't know it's Sunday. Cows still needed milking and pigs needed feeding. But the heavy, back-breaking fieldwork, that stopped. So, right off the bat, that's 52 days of rest from the fields. But it didn't stop there. The medieval year was an obstacle course of holidays. You had the 12 days of Christmas. You had the week of Easter. You had Pentecost, Rogation Days, and All Saints. And then, you had the saints. Every village had a patron saint. Every guild had a patron saint. When you add up the mandatory church holidays, plus the Sundays, plus the seasonal breaks, records from France and Spain, and England after the Black Death, show a staggering number. In some regions, it reached 150 days. That is nearly half the year where the boss couldn't touch you. In the 14th century, the Bishop of Durham's estate records show that his villeins, his serfs, owed him roughly 175 days of labor a year. This is the crucial distinction. That was the time they worked for the Lord. What did they do with the rest of their time? They worked for themselves, farming their own plots to feed their families. Compare that to the average modern worker. We sell almost all our productive hours to an employer. If you tried to make a medieval peasant give up 240 days a year exclusively to the Lord's service, he wouldn't just complain, he would likely revolt. But wait, I can hear the objection. Sure, they had days off, But the work days were brutal, right? Well, let's look at the daily schedule. We tend to imagine agricultural work as a sunrise to sunset marathon. And during harvest time, maybe 6 weeks a year, it was. That was crunch time. But for the rest of the year, the medieval workday was surprisingly relaxed. There were no time clocks, no managers hovering over your shoulder. Reports from the era describe a work style called stint labor. You had a task to do. When it was done, you were done. One account from the 1400s complains that laborers would stop for a long breakfast, stop for a nap in the afternoon, and stop for drinking time in the evening. In fact, scholars estimate the average workday outside of harvest was often 8 hours or less. But what about the slave part? The idea that they had no rights. This is where the Monty Python version really falls apart. I went looking for court records, legal disputes between lords and peasants, and I expected to find a list of executions. Instead, I found lawsuits. Peasants could and did sue their lords in manorial courts, and sometimes they won. We have records of peasants suing over excessive rent, suing because the lord's cows trampled their garden, suing because the lord tried to increase their work hours. They were not slaves. They were part of a rigid system, yes, but it was a system of mutual obligation. The lord had to protect them. If he failed, or if he violated the custom of the manor, the community could resist. And this brings us to the most important missing piece, the thing we have lost entirely: the commons. In a medieval village, not all land was owned privately. Large tracts were common land. If you lost your job today, you might starve or lose your home. But a medieval peasant had a safety net that couldn't be taken away. He could graze a cow on the commons for milk. He could fish in the common stream. He could gather wood from the common forest. And after the harvest, he had gleaning rights, the legal right to go into the lord's fields and take any grain left behind. Poverty was real. Life was hard. Winter was cold. But the crushing, isolated anxiety of the modern worker, the fear of falling through the cracks and having nothing, that was rare. So, if they worked less, had legal rights, and had a guaranteed safety net, why do we think they died at 35? This is a statistical illusion. Infant mortality was horrific. Perhaps 30 to 50% of children died before age 5. That drags the average down to 35. But if you survived childhood, if you made it to 21, demographic records suggest it was perfectly normal to live into your 50s or 60s. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales features a plowman. He isn't a dying boy. He's a sturdy, middle-aged man. So we have a picture of a life that is hard, yes. Physically demanding, yes. But it is a life with rhythm, with community, and with vast amounts of rest. Which raises the uncomfortable question: if their lives weren't the horror story we've been told, who wrote the horror story? And why? The myth of the miserable peasant wasn't invented in the Middle Ages. It was invented in the 19th century. During the Industrial Revolution, the world changed. Factory owners needed a new kind of worker. They didn't need someone who worked based on the seasons. They needed someone who worked based on the clock. 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, year-round. They stripped away the holidays. They enclosed the commons, fencing off the land that used to be free for everyone. The peasants were forced into the cities, and for the first time in history, they truly did become slaves to their work. The quality of life for the average worker collapsed. They worked twice as many hours as their medieval ancestors for worse food in deadlier conditions. So, how do you get people to accept this new normal? You tell them a story. You tell them that the past was a dark, barbaric nightmare. You tell them that this, the smoke, the noise, the relentless grind, is progress. We invented the dark ages to make our own age look brighter. We looked at the peasant with his 150 days off, his community safety net, his afternoon naps, and we called him miserable. Because if we admitted the truth, we might have to ask ourselves who the real serfs are. This story reminds us that what we call progress is often just a story told by the winners. But the calendar isn't the only thing history has lied to you about. I'm here to help you know the daily lives history forgot. What other common knowledge about history do you suspect is wrong? Tell me in the comments. See you at the next harvest.